Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about hook size versus yarn size for making plushies and why it's important. So a few reasons why it's important to use the correct size hook, which can actually vary depending on the brand of yarn. But the correct size hook for your yarn size is, for one, so you don't get a bunch of holes in your project, so it looks all nice and even, and the stitches look similar, and just to create an overall better product. So you may be looking at all of these and be like, oh yeah, they all look good, they all look like symmetrical, the stitches look good and everything, they're just different sizes. All of these are the same yarn with just different hook sizes. The only one that was a little bit different was the smallest one. I had to loosen my tension just a little bit because it was very difficult to work with that hook size for this yarn. This is the yarn that I used for this. You can get it at Hobby Lobby. It is a 5 bulky. Now let's get into the different hook sizes. I went all the way from a 3.5 to a 6.5. So 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, 5.5, 6, 6.5. The hook size that I usually use for a 5 weight is between a 4 and a 5. So this is the 4. As you can see, when you separate it, you can't see holes in the project. It looks very uniform. It is very sturdy, but it's still like movable and squishy. And you can absolutely see no hole, not even when I try to like push my finger through, there's the slightest bit. So you know when you decrease, because when you're decreasing your stitches making plushies, it's creating bigger holes on each side. So you know if your project is looking like this with your hook size, that when you decrease, you don't have to worry about there being too big of holes where your stuffing's showing or the backs of your safety eyes coming through. Now this one's the one that I used a 3.5 hook with. This is the hook that I used for that. You can see these are all increased to 18. They're all made exactly the same. You can see instead of being flat like it's supposed to be, it's very pivoted in the middle where your magic ring is. And that's because it's so tight that it just clumps together. It is very stiff. If I made something with this hook size in this yarn, it would not be as squishy, as fun to play with. Now there's no holes, so that's a good thing, but it was very, very difficult and hurt my hands to try to even make something this small with that. I already showed you the 4, so I'm going to set that to the side. Here is the 4.5. Again, that's the actual size that I usually use with this yarn. So again, you're stretching it, you're not seeing holes, and if you like press through, you're seeing just very, a little bit of hole. It's flat. All the stitches look even and symmetrical. When you decrease, it's not going to create big holes in it, and it's definitely not big enough for safety eyes to poke through. Now if you continue to the 5, when you pull it apart, you may see just a tiny bit of a hole. So I know when I decrease, I might see the holes just a little bit on this one. I would want to tighten my tension, but it's going to be super squishy. So that one would still be okay to use as long as you made sure you kept your tension tight. Here is the 5.5. You can see the holes a lot more, especially on the seam. That is a big hole for a seam. Let's go back to the 5 so I can show you. It's got a little bit of a hole. You wouldn't want to put your safety eye there, and you'd want to be careful stuffing for that one. This is the size that I usually use. In the seam, you're still going to see that seam, but it's not as prominent. This one, as soon as you spread where the seam is, you see that big hole. So I would not recommend this size, even though it would be super squishy. I just feel like there's so much of a chance your safety eyes could poke through, and when you start decreasing, that hole's only going to get bigger and you'll be able to see your stuffing through it. The 6 is the same, like the holes are very, very prominent now when you pull it. So when it's stuffed, that is what you're going to see, you're stuffing through it. Very huge hole by the seam, so you would definitely see through that, and I can almost stick my fingers through the actual holes between the stitches, so I know my safety eyes might come out on this one. And then the 6.5 obviously is much, much worse, especially along the seam. So that would just not be recommended if you're making plushies. It wouldn't be safe if you're using safety eyes, and it just would not look neat if you're stuffing them. Now, if you're making one like a lovey where you're not actually stuffing them, you know, this hook size might, I know it's stretched out now, so this hook size or even this one might be okay, but you got to think kids are going to like tear things apart, so as they continue to stretch and pull on their toy, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And you take, I know with stuffy or with loveys, you usually don't use safety eyes, you embroider the eyes, so that's not as big of a concern, but you just, your tails will fall out and it's just a whole big mess. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about how to tell if you're using a appropriate hook size without actually like making anything with it. So to tell if your hook size will be okay, you're just going to take your yarn, and let's start with the smallest hook. See how it overflows like majorly through the actual hook of your yarn, or the hook. Oh. Jeez, I can't talk today. It just overflows a lot through the hook, so that is a telltale sign it's going to be way too small of a hook. The 4, which is the smallest I would recommend for a 5-weight yarn, although every brand is going to be a little bit different on the size, so that's why you can check it like this. If you look, the 4, it still overflows. Even if I pull the fibers down, it still overflows, so you know it's going to be a tighter one, but it doesn't overflow so much that it would just make it where it's too stiff. Now the 4.5, this is what I usually use with this yarn. When you pull it, you can see it fills it pretty decently. It's pretty much to the end. That I think is perfect. The 5, without pulling it, the fibers are almost to the end. With pulling it, you have just a little bit of gap, which means you're just going to have a little bit of a hole. The 5.5, pretty much with the fibers, it fills it completely. When you pull it back, you have a little bit bigger of a gap, which means you're going to have a little bit bigger of a hole. And we already know these ones are not good for this size, but I'm going to show you with the biggest one, just so you can see. Oh, I can't even pull it back on that one. Just so you can see, like, the hook pretty much goes over the fibers, and if I were able to on this hook pull the fibers back, let me grab a different hook just so you can see. We'll grab a 7. So when you pull the fibers back, there is a huge gap, so that hole is just going to be way too big for your plushies. You're not going to want to use that size. It's just going to create a lot of problems. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and that it gives you a little bit of advice on how to choose your hook size. I also have this little, these are the sizes I use most of my yarn for the Chanel yarn for plushies. For a 4-weight, I usually go with a size in the middle of what's listed. So like 5-weight says 4 to 5, I usually use a 4.5, but it can vary depending on the brand of yarn. So 4-weight would be 2.5 to 3.5, 5-weight would be 4 to 5, 6-weight would be 5.5 to 6. You could even get away probably with a 6.5 on this one. I'm not too sure. I usually use either a 5.5 or 6, just depending on the brand. I've never tried a 6.5. But I hope that helps you guys out a lot and answers some questions. Happy crocheting!